right now we are going to continue with a talk by Tom Cordero. We're very lucky to have a justice minister here on staff at St. Margaret Mary who helps us understand more deeply and see the opportunity to be more just people and how that ties into our faith. Thank you very much, Tom.
Great. Well, hello, everybody.
Hello.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and all the RE people for inviting me to speak to you today about racial justice. We're going to talk about racism and racial justice. And the first thing to think about is that sometimes talking about things like racism can make people very uncomfortable. And so if you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable during my presentation, it's okay. It's normal and you shouldn't worry about it. But try to keep an open heart and an open mind to everything you're going to hear. And keep this in mind too, that sometimes the most important things that we learn are during times when we do feel a little uncomfortable. Okay, so keep that in mind. I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint here, and I'm going to click on here. Hold on. Slideshow from the beginning. There we go. All right. Well, I want to start out by saying something that's really obvious, but we don't often think much about. And that is that we live in a wonderful world full of all sorts of creatures of many different colors and shapes and sizes. And one good example of that are flowers. I love flowers, especially wildflowers. And there are so many different shapes and colors of flowers out there. But imagine how boring it would be if all the flowers in the world were the same shape and the same color. That'd be pretty boring. But what God did with flowers, God also did with every creature on earth. He made them so unique and different. And just like no two snowflakes are exactly alike, no two creatures that God created are exactly alike. And the same is true for people. That God created the human family in a variety of different colors and different shapes and different sizes. And the fact is that no two people are exactly alike. So the question then is, well, what is race? Because we hear that talked about a lot, people of different races. Well, what is a race? Well, race is a way of dividing members of the human family into groups based on the way they look, the color of their skin, the shape of their nose. So if that's what race is, then what is racism? What is racism? Well, racism is the belief that these differences determine the value or the worth of a person. Racism is the belief that some races are better than others. And racism has led some to believe that because some races are better than others, that some people should be made slaves and other people should be their master. It's also led other people to believe that some kinds of people should not have the same rights as everybody else. Now, what the church teaches us is that racism is a sin. The Bible says there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male nor female, but you are all one in Christ Jesus. In fact, the church teaches us that we may be wonderfully diverse and different from one another, but we all belong to the same family. Just recently, Pope Francis said, "We cannot tolerate or turn a blind eye to racism and exclusion of any form, and claim to defend the sacredness of every human life. And the truth is this, that racism is an insult to God, because we are less than what God intended us to be because of this destructive power of racism to convince us to believe a lie that some people are superior to other people because of the way they look or the color of their skin. And by working to try to end racism, we're standing up for God's revealed truth, that we are, every single one of us, members of the same family, sons and daughters of the same God. And we should treat each other with respect and with love. Now, one way that racism is taught and made more powerful in the world is through something called segregation. Segregation is keeping white people with white people, black people with black people, brown people with brown people, keeping them in separate neighborhoods, separate schools, even separate churches. So what are some examples of segregation? Well, there was a time not long ago when it was against the law for white people to marry black people. It was against the law. And it really was only 53 years ago that the Supreme Court said that Richard and Mildred Loving could legally be married to each other. That's a picture there of Richard and Mildred, when they finally heard that their marriage was now going to be legal. Now, after the Civil War ended slavery, there were laws that were put into place to keep black people from voting, to keep them in their place as being less important than white people, and to remind black people every day that no matter how smart they were, no matter how rich they might become, that they would never be better than white people. There was a time, not long ago, when schools were legally separated and segregated, some for whites and others for black children and people of color. Now, the white schools had all of the money they needed to give those kids a great education. But the schools that were for the black kids, they had little or nothing. Now, this little girl in this picture, her name is Ruby Bridges. Ruby was the first black child to attend an all-white elementary school in Louisiana back in 1960, when segregation was finally declared illegal. And you see those men around Ruby? Those are U.S. Marshals. And they were there to take her to school because these people did not want Ruby to be in school with their white children. And so the U.S. Marshals had to protect her when she went to school. Even after the schools were desegregated, made illegal, today, schools are just as segregated as they were when Ruby went to class that day in Louisiana. What I'm going to do now is I want to share with you a short video about 4 minutes long. It was made by fifth graders in New York City, and they're going to talk about their own experience with segregation in school.
Segregation is when black and white are separate and not together.
Children of color and white children are separated. There are two different schools, and one is for black people and another one is for white people. Segregation happens, but it's not like happening how as bad as it did before, because before it used to be even worse.
In my class, there's Julia, and she's white, and there's me.
Well, my cousin named Lana, she used to go to a Catholic school. Well, she felt awkward because she was the only black person.
The only other people from the Middle East in the school is my cousins.
Because some people might decide to fit in with the people of the opposite race, but some people might not feel comfortable around people that isn't part of their race.
I've been to a school named PS85, so there were separate classes, English and Spanish, so it wasn't really fair because before I didn't know any English. I only speak Spanish.
I have a sister. She goes to a Catholic school, and her name is Hennessy, and it's like a school for rich people, and she had an opportunity to go, but you don't really see a lot of colored people, but there still is, but there's more white people that you see in the school.
One main reason I think that is because of the money too. Private schools tend to be more expensive.
I think that schools are segregated because of based on where you live, because people of color live with people of color and white people live with other white people.
My mom was looking at a school for me to go to, and the population for whites was really large, and the blacks were really small. I think one of the reasons they did that was because number one, they still think whites are better, and number two, because segregation is illegal and they still feel like whites are better, they want mainly white people, but having one or two black people and a couple Latino, it makes them seem like not totally white. Well, I think diversity is good because, people, we won't only have, people that are from your culture. You have different people. You could talk to different people. You won't be talking to the same people.
Okay, can you hear me? So the question then becomes, what do we do about all this? What do we do about racism? How can we begin to end it? Well, the first thing to note is that racism has plagued our country for over 400 years, and it's going to take a long time to put an end to it. Now, we have made great progress in overcoming racism, but we still got a long way to go. And one way for white folks to begin to end racism is to learn to see the world with new eyes. We need to understand that the way we see the world is not the way people of other races see the world. And what we think of as just being normal or just the way things are done is in fact just one way of doing things, one way of being. So let's look at some examples to try to see the world through the eyes of someone who is not white. Now, before the pandemic, when the schools were open and you could go in person, right? You'd get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you comb your hair, you go out the door ready to learn. But for many Black children, the way they wear their hair could get them into trouble at school. This boy on the top picture, he was not allowed to graduate because of the way he wore his hair. The little girl in the corner with the pink ribbon, she was sent home from school because of the way she wore her hair. And this little boy in the corner, he was also thrown out of school and sent home because of the way he wore his hair. For some schools, if you want to attend classes, you have to wear your hair like white people do, not like Black people. Let's look at another example. When we go to church, we see pictures of God and statues of Jesus and Mary and Joseph and the saints. And the one thing they all have in common is they all look like us. They all look like white people. But we know, as a matter of fact, that Jesus and the Holy Family were not white people. And the people who lived in that part of the world when Jesus was alive were actually brown. So when Black and brown children look at these pictures of a white God and a white Holy Family, it's very easy for them to come to the conclusion that maybe they're not children of God. Maybe they're children of a lesser God. But what if we imagined Jesus not as a white person, but as a Black person? What if we imagined the Blessed Virgin Mary not as a white woman, but as a Black woman? How would that change the way we think about God? How would that change the way we think about Black people? And we're all familiar with that story from Christmas of how Mary and Joseph went to Bethlehem to look for a place to stay, and they couldn't find one. So they had to go into a stable, and that's where Jesus was born. And of course, all of the pictures we've ever seen about this story, Jesus, Mary and Joseph and everybody in the story is all white. But what if instead of Joseph and Mary, that this was a story about Jose and Maria looking for a place to stay, with Maria about to give birth to a child? How would this change the way we see this story? How would it change the way we think about Mexicans and about Latinos? The truth is that some of the most familiar and ordinary things in our lives can teach us that white people are worth more than Black people. For instance, Band-Aids, right? If you get a cut or a scrape and you go to your mom, she'll give you a Band-Aid, and that Band-Aid, for the most part, is going to look like your skin. It's going to fit in so it doesn't stand out. But that same Band-Aid on a person of color, a Black person, stands out like a sore thumb. So people of color, brown people and Black people, are taught that they're not as important as white people. You can find some different color Band-Aids, but they're not easy to find. They're not at every store. It's not very convenient a lot of times. So Band-Aids are skin colored, which means that they are white skin colored. Let's look at another example. If we go into a toy store and we go to the doll section, right? This is pretty typical of what we see in the doll section. All sorts of pretty dolls dressed in all kinds of costumes with different color hair, right? But we don't see very many dolls of Black skin or of brown skin. So what if we went to a doll store and we looked up at all the dolls, and what if we saw this instead? What message would that send to white little girls about what it means to be pretty, or how they should pretend to be like the dolls, or to play with the dolls, or be best friends with the dolls? Now imagine a Black girl at the doll store looking at these dolls. What would she think about what it means to be pretty and what it means to be someone to want to look up to or desire to be? So the way we see the world around us really depends on our own life experiences and the messages that the world tells us about ourselves. The truth is that things are not always what they seem to be. So for instance, in this picture, from the point of view of the person taking this photograph, the deer is crossing the road. But from the point of view of the deer, right, it is the road that is crossing through her forest where she lives. It all depends on your point of view. The truth is that every person is a reflection of God. And this is why every person, regardless of the color of the skin or the shape of their eyes or face, should be precious in our eyes too. So I'm going to end my little presentation now. And I think I'm going to turn this over to Jackie.
Thank you so much, Tom. I really like those ideas. You gave us a lot to think about.